They spoke German at my daughter's dinner table, laughing about me in words they were certain I couldn't understand. They called me a tired old man with a government pension and soft hands, said my daughter had married well enough to finally escape her modest upbringing, and that the sooner I learned to stay quiet in rooms I didn't belong in, the more comfortable everyone would be. My son-in-law joined in with a smirk he didn't bother to hide, adding something about how men like me always think their silence is dignity, when really it's just irrelevance. They sat there in my daughter's dining room in East Vancouver, eating food she had spent 2 days preparing, drinking wine I had brought, and building a little fortress of contempt around me using a language they believed was their private wall. But here's what they didn't know. I had spent 4 years in Düsseldorf in the 90s. I spoke their language well enough to dream in it, and I had been waiting for the right moment my entire adult life to let people like them discover exactly what they'd assumed away. Drop a heart in the comments if you're on the quiet side, the side that watches, remembers, and acts when the time is right. And tell me, have you ever stayed silent when staying silent was the hardest thing you'd ever done? It started on a Wednesday afternoon in October, the kind of day Vancouver does when autumn arrives properly. Gray sky, wet leaves on the sidewalk, the smell of the inlet carried in on the wind. I was in my workshop behind the house, finishing a set of dovetail joints on a cabinet I was building, for no particular reason except that woodworking is the only thing that fully quiets my mind. My phone sat on the corner of the bench, and when it lit up with my son-in-law's name, I felt something shift in the air, the same way pressure drops before rain. Marcus and I had never found an easy rhythm. He was 38, sharp-dressed, worked in commercial real estate acquisitions, and had a way of speaking to me that was always technically polite but carried beneath it a quiet assumption that I was background scenery in his life with my daughter. He'd never asked me a single question about my career. Not once in 2 years. I was Robert, Emily's father, the retired engineer who drove a 10-year-old truck and lived in the same East Vancouver house I'd bought in 1989. Robert, he said, and I noticed he never called me anything warmer than that. Great news. My parents flew in from Düsseldorf last night. We'd love to have you for dinner on Saturday. Very relaxed, just family. Get to know each other properly. I set down my chisel. How is Emily doing? I haven't heard from her this week. A small pause. She's great. Busy with the planning. You know how she gets. Saturday, 7 o'clock. Oh, and Robert, my parents are quite traditional. Very European. They appreciate things kept straightforward. No need to go into old war stories or anything like that. Old war stories. I was 67 years old and had designed the structural load systems for 3 of the buildings currently visible from his office window. But I said none of that. I'll be there, I said. After I hung up, I stood at the bench for a long time, watching sawdust settle. Something in his phrasing sat wrong. Not the words themselves, but the architecture of them, the way a man who has already decided something talks to the thing he's decided about. I went inside and made tea and thought about Saturday. My daughter Emily had her mother's instinct for hosting the table set early, candles lit, the apartment smelling of roasted garlic and something from the oven that took hours. She hugged me at the door with real warmth, and for a moment I could put aside whatever Marcus had planted in me on the phone. His parents were already in the living room. Heinrich was tall, late 60s, silver at the temples, the kind of man who carries himself like his posture is a professional credential. His wife Ingrid wore a blazer and a thin smile that arrived slightly after her eyes did. Marcus stood beside them with the satisfied expression of a man presenting something he'd arranged. "Robert, finally," Marcus said, as though I were arriving late to something I'd been excluded from. "My father Heinrich, my mother Ingrid, they've heard so much about you." "Guten Abend," I said. Simply, "Good evening." Heinrich's eyebrows moved a fraction. Ingrid tilted her head. Marcus, to his credit, showed nothing because he had no idea there was anything to show. "You know a few words?" Heinrich said in English, pleasantly enough. "From school?" "Something like that," I said, and I left it exactly there. We moved to the table. Emily brought wine, a Riesling she'd chosen carefully, and I could see her watching the room with the quiet anxiety of someone who wants everything to go well and suspects it might not. I squeezed her hand when she set down my glass, and she gave me a small, grateful look that reminded me of when she was 8 years old and asked me if a thunderstorm would hurt us. The first course arrived. Conversation moved in English pleasantries about Vancouver, The flight from Düsseldorf, the weather. Heinrich spoke with authority about everything. Marcus nodded along. Ingrid smiled selectively. Then Emily excused herself to the kitchen, and the table shifted. Heinrich leaned slightly toward Ingrid and said, in German, that the apartment was nice enough, but reflected a young woman who had clearly not yet been taught what things should cost. His voice was not lowered as much as he imagined. Ingrid replied, also in German, that Emily was sweet but provincial, and that one hoped Marcus wouldn't spend the next 20 years explaining things to her family. I lifted my wine glass and took a slow sip. Marcus added something I will not repeat here about the gap between who he was and where he'd ended up. Meaning me, meaning my house in East Vancouver, meaning the truck in the driveway that I drove, because it had never given me a reason to replace it. I set my glass down. I reached for the bread. I looked out the window at the lights on the inlet. My face held the expression of a man hearing nothing, thinking of nothing, present in the room the way a piece of furniture is present. Emily came back with the main course, and the conversation returned to English, and I watched Heinrich refill his own glass without offering to fill mine first, and I filed that too. By the time dessert arrived, I had memorized every sentence. Not because I was angry. Anger is expensive, and I've learned to spend it carefully. I memorized them because a ledger has to be accurate to be useful. At the door when I left, Marcus clasped my shoulder in the way men do when they've decided they've won something. Great to have you, he said. My parents really enjoyed meeting you. Lovely evening, I said. Emily outdid herself. I drove home along Clark Drive with the window down despite the October cold. The city hummed its familiar note beside me. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. In my study, I have a desk I built myself from reclaimed Douglas fir. I sat at it, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and wrote down everything I'd heard at that table, in German, exactly as it was said. Then I translated it line by line and read it back. Then I turned the page and wrote 2 words. Begin now. I slept well. I always sleep well when I've made a decision. In the morning, I called my old partner, David, who had taken over the firm when I retired 4 years ago. We'd worked together since 1988, built the practice from a 2-desk office in Gastown to one of the mid-sized structural engineering consultancies in the province. I still held a senior partner emeritus position, which meant my name remained on certain legacy agreements, certain provincial certifications, and one particular standing arrangement with the BC Infrastructure and Housing Ministry that had never been formally transferred because the paperwork was cumbersome and neither of us had been in a hurry. You sound like a man with something specific on his mind, David said. I need to know about the Burrard West application, I said. The mixed-use development tender. I heard a German firm is trying to get onto the short list. A pause. Keys clicking. Hertner Group, out of Düsseldorf. They approached us last month about a co-signatory arrangement. They need a BC-registered structural partner with ministry standing to qualify for the provincial bid. The ministry certification they need, it's the Class A load assessment accreditation, the one that's still tied to your name. I had not known this before I called, but I had suspected something of the kind. Tell me more, I said. What David laid out over the next 20 minutes was this. Hertner Group had identified a premium development site in Vancouver's West End, a mid-rise project projected at approximately $90 million in completed value. To qualify for the integrated development approval under the province's updated building code, specifically the Seismic Load Compliance Framework, updated in 2019, a project of that scale required a co-signatory with current Class A structural accreditation from a BC-registered firm. David's firm had it. But the Class A accreditation was grandfathered under my original certification, which meant that any use of it on a new external partnership required my written consent as the originating engineer of record. Heinrich's company needed the Hertner Group's Vancouver bid to succeed. The Hertner Group needed a local structural partner. The local partner couldn't commit without my signature. Have they been told about the consent requirement? I asked. Not in detail, David said. We flagged the partnership arrangement but didn't go into the specific sign-off chain. Why? Because I want to understand the situation completely before I decide anything, I said. Don't mention my involvement to them. Tell them you're working through internal compliance review. That's accurate enough. David was quiet for a moment. He's known me a long time, Robert. Should I be concerned? No, I said. You should trust me. Have I ever made a decision that cost us something we couldn't afford? He laughed, short and dry. Once, the Burnaby Foundation dispute in 2003. And I was right about that too. Just early. We hung up. I sat at the fur desk and looked at the legal pad. Then I picked up my pen and wrote 3 more lines. One name, one date, one question. The name was Heinrich Hertner. The date was 2 weeks from Saturday. The question was, who do you want to be when the room understands everything you've said? I did not call Emily that week. I didn't need to alarm her or tip anything early. But she called me on Thursday, bright and warm, wanting to know if I'd enjoyed the evening. Your roast was exceptional, I said. The Riesling was a good choice. I'm so glad, Dad. Marcus's parents are a bit formal, but I think it went well, don't you? I think everyone showed exactly who they are, I said, which is always useful. A small silence. That's a strange way to put it. Probably, I said. How are you, really? She told me about work, about a project she was managing for a heritage conservation society in Strathcona, about a community garden she'd started volunteering at on weekends. She sounded like herself, curious, purposeful, full of the small enthusiasms her mother had passed to her like an inheritance. I listened and said little, because listening is a thing I have never regretted. On the Friday of the second week, David sent me a message. The Hertner group had followed up again. They were anxious. The provincial bid window was closing in 18 days, and they needed the co-signatory arrangement confirmed to prepare their submission package. Marcus had apparently been the intermediary, pressing David's office twice in 3 days. That evening, Marcus called me directly. It was the first time he had called me for any reason other than logistics. Robert, he said, and his voice had a new quality in it. Careful the way people are careful when they need something they haven't admitted needing. I wanted to check in. See how you're doing. Doing well, I said. Finished the cabinet I was building. Came out well. That's great. That's really great. He paused. I also wanted to mention there's a professional matter my father's company is working through with David's firm. Just routine engineering partnership stuff. I don't know if David mentioned it. He may have said something, I said. Right, yeah. It's a significant project for my family. For us, really, for our future here? My father's been trying to establish a Vancouver presence for years, and this development would be foundational. Another pause. If there are any administrative questions David has, anything that needs clearing up on your end, I want you to know how much this would mean. To my parents. To all of us. I let the silence run long enough to be noticed. Marcus, I said finally, why don't we have dinner? All of us. You and Emily, and your parents, and me. I'd like to get to know your father's work a little better before I weigh in on anything. A beat. That would be yes. Absolutely. That would be wonderful. I know a place, I said. I'll make the reservation. I booked a private room at a restaurant on West Hastings that I have been going to for 20 years. The kind of place where the lighting is honest and the tables are spaced far enough apart that a conversation stays where it belongs. I gave the reservation under my name and asked for a round table, which matters more than people realize. Round tables have no head. I arrived 20 minutes early. I ordered sparkling water and sat with my hands in my lap and let the room arrange itself around me. When the door opened and they entered, Heinrich first, Ingrid close behind, then Marcus with his hand at the small of Emily's back, I stood and said good evening in the way that signals this is my room. I have been here longest. Sit anywhere you like. Emily hugged me. Heinrich extended his hand and I shook it firmly. Ingrid nodded. We sat. Menus came. The conversation opened in English, warm and exploratory on the surface. Heinrich spoke about the Vancouver market, about the West End site, about his company's European credentials. He was impressive and he knew it. Marcus interjected with enthusiasm. Emily smiled politely and caught my eye once or twice with a look that asked whether everything was all right. I smiled back at her. Everything was fine. Then Marcus began talking about the development timeline, and Heinrich leaned toward Ingrid with the ease of a man who had done this before, at my daughter's table, in a restaurant with a man he thought couldn't follow him, and he said in German that they were close, that the old man clearly had no idea what his signature was worth, and that if they managed it carefully they might get his consent for nothing more than a family dinner and a handshake. Ingrid replied, also in German, that men like me were easy, that we were flattered by inclusion and confused by paperwork. Marcus added, voice low and indulgent, that he would handle me. I set down my fork. I touched the corner of my mouth with my napkin. I looked at Heinrich directly and I said, in German, clearly and without heat, that I had lived in Düsseldorf from 1993 to 1997. That I had led the structural review on the Rheinturm substation extension during my second year there, and that the firm I worked with at the time was Büro Kellermann und Strauss, which any engineer from that city would recognize. That my German was perhaps a little stiff after 30 years, but that it had never failed me when accuracy mattered. Then I switched to English. I've understood every word spoken at this table tonight, I said, and every word spoken at Emily's dinner table 2 weeks ago. The room did not make a sound. Heinrich's face did something complicated. Not embarrassment. Not yet. He was too practiced for embarrassment to arrive quickly, but a kind of structural recalculation. The expression of a man revising his blueprints in real time. Ingrid's hand moved to her water glass and stopped. Marcus stared at the tablecloth. His jaw worked once. Emily looked at me, then at Marcus, then back at me, and I watched her understand something that had not been fully visible to her before. I slid a single page across the table to Heinrich. David had prepared it a clear summary of the co-signatory requirement, my position as originating engineer of record, and the consent clause that governed any external use of the Class A accreditation. The engineering is sound, I said. The site has strong bones. The project, if properly structured, is worth doing. But I want you to understand what kind of man you're asking to sign this. Heinrich looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at me. You speak German, he said. It was not quite a question. I speak several things, I said. I found it useful to let people decide what they assume. The things we said, Ingrid began, were said, I replied. I'm not here to replay them. I'm here to tell you that the document in front of you requires my good faith, and my good faith requires yours. Marcus finally raised his head. Marcus, I said. Not now. He went quiet. I had never spoken to him with that particular clarity before, and I watched it land differently than anything else I'd ever said to him. Emily was still. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at Marcus with an expression I recognized from her childhood, the one she wore when she was assembling a full picture from pieces she hadn't expected to fit together the way they did. I turned back to Heinrich. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer. German to German, if you prefer. He nodded, once. In German, I asked him whether the conversation at my daughter's table 2 weeks ago reflected how he intended to conduct this business relationship. Whether the man he'd described that night, the tired old man with soft hands who should stay quiet in rooms he didn't belong in, was someone he could honestly ask to trust him with his signature. Heinrich was quiet for what felt like a full minute. He was not, I realized, a stupid man. He was a proud man, which is a different problem but a solvable one. No, he said, in German. It does not. Good, I said. Then we can talk. We ordered dinner. The food was excellent, as it always is at that table. The conversation that followed was different in quality from anything that had come before it real. A little awkward in places, occasionally stilted as people learned to talk to each other rather than past each other. Heinrich asked me about my Düsseldorf years. I told him about the Rheinturm work, about the cold winter of '94, about the engineer at Büro Kellermann who had taught me that Germans respect silence the same way they respect precision because both are a form of honesty. He laughed at that, a real one. Ingrid spoke less, but she listened more. She asked Emily about her heritage conservation work, and the question had genuine interest in it, the first time I'd seen her extend herself toward my daughter like that. Marcus said little for most of the meal. He refilled glasses and asked no unnecessary questions. Near the end of the evening, as coffee came, Marcus looked at me across the round table. I owe you an apology, he said, not smoothly, not with his usual practiced ease. He said it like something that cost him something. You owe Emily one too, I said, for the things you said about her at her own table. He looked at his wife. Emily was watching him with a stillness I recognized as judgment held in suspension, not yet decided, not yet forgiven, but not yet finished either. I know, he said. She didn't answer him right then. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Dad, she said, you've been sitting on this for 2 weeks? I wanted to understand the full picture, I said. Before I did anything with it, is that the engineer in you or the father? At this point, I said, I'm not sure those are separate things. She laughed quietly, and the tension in the room shifted into something breathable. I signed the consent documents 3 days later. I did it at David's office with full review of the partnership terms, with protections written in for audit rights and project-level sign-off on any structural modifications, standard language for a co-signatory arrangement. Nothing punitive. The Hertner Group's Vancouver bid went forward. The project, as best I can tell, has merit. What I wanted was never to stop them. What I wanted was for them to know exactly who they were dealing with before any of us moved a step further. You cannot build a sound structure on a foundation that was measured wrong at the start. Emily called me the following Sunday morning. She had spent the week in conversation with Marcus. Real conversation, she said. Not the kind that manages the surface, but the kind that goes into the walls and checks what's holding. He didn't know you spoke German, she said. No, I didn't know either. You were 17 when I went to Düsseldorf, I said. You were living with your mother. I was working 18-hour days and missing you every one of them. I didn't talk about those years much when I came back because they were the years I wasn't there for you. The German was part of all of that. She was quiet for a moment. I wish I'd known. Teach it to me, she said. That surprised me. You want to learn German? I want to know the thing that was yours, she said. During those years I thought I'd lost you. I want to know what you were doing. So we started, Sunday mornings, over the phone, with a workbook she bought from a bookshop on Commercial Drive. Her pronunciation in the first lesson was exactly as bad as mine was in my first week in Düsseldorf, and I told her so, and we both laughed until it hurt. There is something about learning a language that is not like learning anything else. It requires you to be uncertain without being embarrassed, to reach for a word that isn't quite there yet, to trust that your mouth will catch up to your meaning. It makes you brave in small doses. Emily took to it the way she takes to everything she cares about, slowly at first, and then with full commitment. At Christmas time, the 4 of us had dinner at my house. I made my late wife's roast potato recipe and a wild sockeye I'd been marinating since Tuesday. Heinrich and Ingrid were there, and the conversation moved between English and German with easy transitions. No walls between them. Heinrich said, over dessert, that the Vancouver project was progressing well, that he was grateful for the partnership. He said it in German, looking at me directly. I answered him in German and said that I was glad the project had good bones. That was all. Later, when Heinrich and Ingrid had gone back to their hotel and Marcus was cleaning up in the kitchen, Emily sat with me on the back steps the way she used to as a child. The December air was sharp and clean and smelled of the coast. The maple in the yard had lost every leaf and stood against the night sky with the bare confidence of a thing that knows it will come back. Does it feel finished? She asked. Nothing real ever finishes, I said. It just finds its right shape. She leaned into my shoulder. What was the German word you used at dinner? The one I didn't catch. Vertrauen, I said. What does it mean? Trust, I said, but also faith. The kind you extend before you know how it will land. She repeated it quietly, shaping the syllables. The yard held its December stillness, and the city hummed beyond the fence, and somewhere on the inlet a freighter was making its slow way toward open water. Vertrauen, she said again. The pronunciation was good. Not perfect, but honest. Again, I said. She said it again, and the night, for the first time in a while, felt exactly the size it was supposed to be. Sometimes the quiet ones carry the most. Not because silence is easy, but because they've learned that timing matters more than volume. My father taught me that staying in a room while people reveal themselves is not passivity, it is the most disciplined form of attention. You don't win those moments by interrupting them. You win them by being ready when they finish. If anyone ever told you that your patience was weakness, that your stillness was defeat, I want you to know it isn't. I want you to know that the rooms you've sat in quietly, absorbing more than anyone realized, have been preparing you for the exact moment when truth needs a voice that doesn't shake. Hold on to what you know. Let others fill the silence with what they assume. And when the time is right, the words will be there. They always are. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Have you ever been in a room where you understood more than anyone realized? I'd love to hear your story. And if you believe in the quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it has to make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next,